The whole world is guilty before God, and doing the works of Mosaic law, such imperfect, incomplete, less than 100% obedience to the Mosaic law, this will not enable unrighteous men to be declared righteous in God's sight. Chapter 3, verse 20. For by works of law, no flesh will be righteousified in his sight, since through law comes knowledge of sin. If there is no way for someone to be righteous in God's sight by doing works of the Mosaic law, then is there any way for unrighteous men to be declared righteous in God's sight? This is very important because as long as we remain unrighteous in God's sight, His wrath is the only destiny that we can expect to face in the lake of fire. So anyone who treasures his soul, his eternal destiny, will want to know exactly how he can be righteous in God's sight. And here comes the good news, verse 21. But now, God's righteousness has been manifested apart from law, being witnessed to by the law and the prophets. But now, a new period of history has dawned. In this new period, God's righteousness has been manifested apart from Mosaic law for the benefit of unrighteous men. What is the meaning of God's righteousness has been manifested apart from law? So let me share with you two meanings of God's righteousness in this context. Firstly, God's righteous manifestation number one, God's righteous character is revealed or manifested when He keeps His promises to save His people. Meaning number one. Apart from Mosaic law, this happens. In addition, God's righteousness also means the legal status, righteous, that God gives to His originally unrighteous people. We are originally unrighteous, but God gives us another status in His sight. He calls the unrighteous righteous. Okay? And this comes even though God's people have not done the works of the Mosaic law in perfection, in 100% obedience. Even in that situation, God calls them righteous. And this status, righteous in God's sight, is a status that comes from God as a free gift given to redeemed believers, which is why it is rightly called God's righteousness, since the status righteous is the result of God's work. So these are the two meanings of God's righteousness, how it has been manifested apart from works of Mosaic law and instead manifested in the good news preached by the apostles. So how can God save unrighteous men instead of punishing unrighteous men, which is just? How can God do so? You see, it is true that when God keeps His promises to save His people, it will show that He is righteous. It manifests His righteous character. So if He saves them, He keeps His promise, righteous God. But at the same time, if He wants to save His righteous, if he wants to save His people, doesn't that contradict His promises to also punish unrighteous men? If God just lets unrighteous men go unpunished, that manifests an unrighteous character in God. So there's a problem here. How can unrighteous men become righteous in God's sight without doing the works of Mosaic law? especially for a Jewish person, this would be mind-boggling at first. And you wonder, is this true, Paul? Yes, it is. The law and the prophets, in other words, the whole Old Testament scriptures, continuously bear witness that unrighteous men can become righteous in God's sight without doing works of the Mosaic law. And Paul will explicitly provide Old Testament proof for this teaching later on in Romans chapter 4. But before we go there in the future, Paul begins to explain how unrighteous men can receive this status, righteous. How we can receive this status from God. Verse 22. That is, God's righteousness through faith in Jesus' anointed one, for all who believe. God's righteousness, introduced in verse 21, is defined even more closely in verse 22. Firstly, God will save unrighteous men through their faith in Jesus' anointed one. As a result, when God saves his believing people, his righteous character is manifested. He kept his promise to save them. He is righteous. God's righteousness, number 2. When unrighteous man puts his faith in Jesus, the anointed one, God declares that this unrighteous man is now righteous in God's sight, with God's own righteousness. Notice here carefully that it does not say Jesus' righteousness or Christ's righteousness, certainly not Christ's imputed righteousness. This is always what Protestants have traditionally taught. This Protestant tradition is not found in the scriptures. Unfortunately, if that is shocking, you should read the article that I posted. It's in the YouTube description. God's righteousness, not Jesus' righteousness. Question: who is God's righteousness for? Answer: for all who believe. For both Jews and non-Jews who believe in Jesus' anointed one. What if someone argued, why not make one way for unrighteous Jews to be saved? And that way is through doing works of the Mosaic law, without needing to believe in Jesus the Anointed One. Then make another way for the unrighteous nations to be saved, through faith in Jesus the Anointed One and without needing to do works of the Mosaic law. In other words, 2 ways of salvation. One for Jews, don't need faith, just do works of Mosaic law. No need faith in Jesus the Anointed One. Just do your works of the Mosaic law and you will be saved from God's wrath. One way of salvation for Jews. Then for non-Jews, believe in Jesus the Anointed One, have faith, but don't need to do the works of the Mosaic law. 2 ways of salvation. False. There's no such thing. There is only one way for unrighteous men to be declared righteous in God's sight. Verse 21, righteousness of God apart from Mosaic law. Verse 22, righteousness of God through faith in Jesus' anointed one. This method to become righteous in God's sight applies to both Jews and non-Jews. Believe in Jesus' anointed one, have faith, don't need to do works of the Mosaic law. One and only one method of salvation. There is no distinction. Why one and only one method of salvation? For reason, there is no distinction. Why? Verse 23, for all have sinned, all, and are falling short of the glory of God, being righteousified as a free gift by his favor. There is no distinction means there is no essential, fundamental difference between the way God saves Jews and the way God saves the non-Jewish nations. There's one and only one way to save Jews and non-Jews. You see, there's an essential similarity between Jews and non-Jews. Similarity Everyone from both Jews and the nations have sinned. That point has been made since chapter 1 verse 18 to 3 verse 9 and 20. Everyone from both Jews and the nations are even now presently falling short of the glory of God. All unbelieving Jews and all unbelieving nations presently fall short of the glory of God. All have sinned. Everyone has missed the mark of God's standard of 100% sinless righteousness. And just an important clarification, all have sinned includes Mary, the mother of Jesus, but obviously excludes Jesus himself. Catholic tradition, I'm quoting a Roman Catholic scholar, Catholic tradition adds that Mary, the mother of Jesus, was likewise preserved sinless throughout her life by a special grace of God. This comes from the Council of Trent Decree on Original Sin 6, Canons on Justification 23. You can see the link provided in the YouTube description for the rebuttal of all these man-made Roman Catholic traditions regarding Mary. The Mary of the Roman Catholic Church is no longer the Mary of the Scriptures. And the reason why all have sinned excludes Jesus is because there are so many explicit verses which teach that Jesus was indeed sinless, whereas there is not a single verse which teaches that Mary was sinless. And so, when the Bible says all have sinned, that should include Mary, since there are no reasons, no explicit verses which force us to exclude her from this description. All have sinned, and thus are falling short of the glory of God. What does that mean, fall short of the glory of God? You see, Adam was created in the glorious, sinless, perfectly righteous image of God. Genesis 1 verse 26 and 5 verse 1. But after he sinned against God, he no longer reflected that same glorious, sinless, perfectly righteous image of God. And since all mankind are descendants of that fallen Adam, we all are born in the likeness of Adam's fallen image. Genesis 5 verse 3. All mankind thus also fails to reflect the original, glorious, sinless, perfectly righteous image of God. This is what it means by all are falling short of the glory of God. No longer perfectly righteous like God is. So, to recap, Jews and non-Jews have the same problem. Both Jews and the nations fall short of God's glory, are unrighteous in His sight, and thus doomed to face God's wrath in punishment. Same problem. So same problem given the same solution. Both believing Jews and believing non-Jews receive the same free gift from God in order to become righteous in God's sight and thus be saved from God's wrath. Same problem, same solution. God's saving method is the same for Jew and non-Jews, no distinction. What does being righteous justified as a free gift by His favor mean? It means that God declares an unrighteous man righteous in His sight. This is the believer's new legal status, righteous. Put it more directly, God says to the believer, you are righteous in my sight. You have no guilt in my sight, and thus you do not need to face any punishment in the lake of fire. Since the believer is now righteous in God's sight, God can keep His promise to save him. And as a result, when God keeps His promise to save him, God's righteous character is manifested. The promise-keeping God is righteous. Question: but why should God declare unrighteous men to be righteous in His sight and save him? Why should God do that? I mean, God is righteously angry at unrighteous people. God owes the originally unrighteous person nothing but punishment. Why should God help the unrighteous? Answer: God decided to show undeserved favor, unmerited favor to his originally unrighteous people. God gave this amazing free gift of righteousness to sinners. Verse 24, being righteousified as a free gift by his favor. That's what this phrase means. And how to receive this free gift of being righteousified, being righteous in God's sight? How to receive this free gift? Through the redemption that is in Anointed One, Jesus. The righteous status is the result of redemption from slavery under sin. You are righteous in God's sight because the Anointed One, Jesus, has redeemed you from slavery under sin. And this word redemption, we need to understand it a bit carefully. Paul's good news was promised from the Old Testament. That's what Romans 1 verse 1 to 2 said. His good news is based on the Old Testament scriptures. Thus, to understand Paul's use of this key term redemption, we must understand its Old Testament background. You see, God redeemed Israel from Egyptian slavery. God set Israel free from slavery. How? God punished Egypt with 10 plagues of judgment. And the 10th plague was unique. The only way Israel would avoid this plague of God's judgment was to offer an animal sacrifice. These sacrifices, the Passover lambs, they were sacrificed so that God would spare Israel from judgment when he was striking down the Egyptian firstborns. The blood of the Passover lambs was the price that was paid to spare Israel from God's judgment. Then, after God struck Egypt with the 10th plague, Egypt released Israel. God had set Israel free. God had redeemed his people from slavery. In short, redemption has two aspects. Number one, freeing God's people from slavery. How? By number two, paying a price. Freeing someone from slavery by paying a price. So let's apply this understanding of redemption to chapter 3, verse 24. Redemption involves freeing God's people not just from physical slavery to Egypt, but freeing God's people from spiritual slavery to sin. Under sin, 3 verse 9. Redemption means freeing God's people from spiritual slavery to sin. How? By paying a price. And Paul proceeds to elaborate on how the price was paid. So, if someone wants God to redeem him, he needs to be in Anointed One Jesus, in relationship with Anointed One Jesus. And this redemption cost God dearly. God paid the highest price possible to free unrighteous slaves of sin. Anointed One Jesus, whom, verse 25, God intended as a propitiation. See, God intended to sacrifice the Anointed One Jesus. It was not Jesus who came up with the idea to die for sinners, to force God to save them. No, that was not what happened. God intended to give the free gift of being righteousified to his unrighteous people. This was God's plan, prophesied from the Old Testament. Jesus carried out God's plan. God intended Jesus as a propitiation. You remember that man's unrighteousness has already provoked God to righteous anger. But instead of requiring the unrighteous to experience his wrath in full, God planned for the Anointed One, Jesus, to experience his wrath instead, in their place. So the Anointed One, Jesus, was a propitiation. He suffered God's wrath on behalf of the unrighteous when he died on the cross. The death penalty was executed. The sin of unrighteous men was punished. God's justice was served. Thus, God's wrath was propitiated, completely spent. Again, God is no longer angry with us. As a result, the unrighteous are now righteous in God's sight. And God can declare to the person, you are righteous. No remaining guilt. No remaining punishment. The punishment has been dealt out already. Anointed One Jesus' shed blood basically was the ultimate sin sacrifice that propitiated God's wrath so that God can declare his originally unrighteous people to be righteous in his sight. And God's unrighteous people can be saved from God's wrath because God's wrath was poured out on Jesus instead. And this is just as Isaiah had prophesied. In other words, the truth that Jesus was a sin sacrifice to propitiate God's wrath, it was not an idea that Paul cooked up. It was simply what the law and the prophets continuously bear witness to. You see, in the Old Testament, God already taught Israel to offer sin sacrifices to atone for their sins. It took the form of animal sacrifices. The unrighteous sinner put his hand on the animal, which was to be sacrificed on his behalf. You can see this in Leviticus chapter 4 and Leviticus chapter 16. This act meant that although the sinner deserved the death penalty for his sin, what happened was the animal paid the price instead. The death penalty was executed. The animal's bloody death atoned for the sinner's sins, and God forgave the sinner. Leviticus 4 verse 35. Besides all these ad hoc sacrifices for sins, there was an annual national Day of Atonement where animals were sacrificed to atone for the sins of the nation, and their blood was sprinkled before the mercy seat. You can see this in Leviticus 16 verse 14 to 17. In other words, in all cases, only the bloody death of the sacrifices atoned for sin. The death penalty must be executed. Leviticus 17 verse 11. For the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it for you on the altar to make atonement for your souls. For it is the blood that makes atonement by the life. The life of the sacrifice must be lost in order for there to be atonement for sin. But animal sacrifices were ultimately insufficient to atone for the sins of God's people. Hebrews 10 verse 4. For it is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins. In other words, doing more works of Mosaic law by offering more animal sin sacrifices ultimately cannot take away sins. And that's why I mentioned earlier that Isaiah had already prophesied that one day God would send his slave to be the ultimate human sin sacrifice. The blood and death of God's slave would atone once and for all for God's unrighteous people, and then make them righteous in his sight. God's sinless slave would suffer the punishment in the place of God's sinful people. Isaiah 53 verse 5. But he was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him, Jesus, was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his wounds we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned every one to his own way, and he has laid on him the iniquity of us all. By oppression and judgment he was taken away. And as for his generation, who considered that he was cut off out of the land of the living, stricken for the transgression of my people, not his own transgression. Yet it was the will of he is to crush him. He has put him to grief. When his soul makes an offering for guilt, when Jesus' soul makes an offering for guilt, he shall see his offspring. He shall prolong his days. The will of he is shall prosper in his hand. Out of the anguish of his soul, out of the anguish of Jesus' soul, he shall see and be satisfied. By his knowledge shall the righteous one, my slave, righteousify many, and he shall bear their iniquities. Therefore I, God, will divide him a portion with the many, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he, Jesus, poured out his soul to death and was numbered with the transgressors, yet he bore the sin of many and makes intercession for the transgressors. Again and again, the same point is being made. God sent one righteous man to bear the sins of many, to take their punishment, to die on our behalf. And the result, many sinners may be declared righteous in God's sight. God paid the highest price ever to redeem unrighteous slaves of sin. The price, the blood of Anointed One Jesus, God's own Son. This free gift of being righteousified is received through faith in his blood. Through faith in the crucified Anointed One Jesus, who died as a sin sacrifice to propitiate God's wrath. An unrighteous man who wants to become righteous in God's sight must believe that the Anointed One Jesus' bloody death was A, intended by God, was B, the ultimate sin sacrifice, was C, the moment when God poured out his wrath on Jesus to spare his unrighteous people from the wrath we actually deserve. Of course, the Jewish leaders schemed. Judas betrayed. Pilate committed injustice. The Roman soldiers carried out their orders and tortured Jesus to death. These are all true, but that is not the full truth about the Anointed One Jesus' death. The full truth is that God intended Jesus, his Son, the Anointed One, to die as a substitute sin sacrifice on behalf of God's unrighteous people to propitiate God's wrath that we deserved. God gives his righteousness as a free gift to the unrighteous who have faith in Jesus' blood, who believe the truths just described above. So faith in the Anointed One Jesus includes faith in the full truth about his death, amongst other truths. God's free gift of righteousness is received through faith in his blood. So, faith in other fake Jesuses who either apparently did not die or apparently did not die as a substitute sin sacrifice to propitiate God's wrath, all these alternative explanations for Jesus' death, or in fact even the denial that Jesus died, that is what Islam teaches. This does not count as saving faith. Faith in his blood. This is what saving faith is, or this is a part of saving faith. The Anointed One Jesus' bloody death was for a proof of God's righteousness because of the passing over of former sins in the forbearance of God. In other words, Anointed One Jesus' bloody death proved that God was righteous. Just think about God's people who lived before Jesus. When they sinned, God passed over their sins. God did not fully punish their sins. God exercised forbearance. But of course, if you think about it, this made God seem unrighteous. Just take David's infamous sin as an example. 2 Samuel chapter 12, verse 7 onwards. Nathan said to David, "You are the man. Thus says he is, the God of Israel. I anointed you king over Israel, and I delivered you out of the hand of Saul. And I gave you your master's house and your master's wives into your arms, and gave you the house of Israel and of Judah. And if this were too little, I would add to you as much more. Why have you despised the word of he is, to do what is evil in his sight? You have struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword, and have taken his wife to be your wife, and have killed him with the sword of the Ammonites. Therefore now, the sword shall never depart from your house, because you have despised me, and have taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your wife. Thus says he is, Behold, I will raise up evil against you out of your own house, and I will take your wives before your eyes, and give them to your neighbor, and he shall lie with your wives in the sight of this sun. For you did it secretly, but I will do this thing before all Israel and before the sun. David said to Nathan, I have sinned against he is. And Nathan said to David, He is also has put away your sin. You shall not die. Nevertheless, because by this deed you have utterly scorned he is, the child who is born to you shall die. When David confessed his sins, God forgave him and spared him the death penalty. It's clear that it's not as though God did not punish David at all. God punished David in several ways, but the point is that God did not punish David to the fullest extent that David deserved with the death penalty. And this is why David said rightly in Psalm 103 verse 10, He does not deal with us according to our sins, nor repay us according to our iniquities. That is, God did not repay him fully according to what he deserved for his iniquities and sins. This is what it means when God passed over former sins out of his forbearance, his patience. In fact, God did not just pass over only David's sins, God did so for all of his people. Not a single one of God's people are sinless and perfect, as David confessed, Psalm 143, verse 2, Enter not into judgment with your slave, for no one is living before you. But if God continuously passes over former sins and does not fully punish them, then actually God is unrighteous. After all, he himself had said in Proverbs 17 verse 15, He who righteousifies the wicked and he who condemns the righteous are both alike an abomination to he is. If you say that the wicked is righteous, you are an abomination to God. And so that's what God said, but it appears that God is doing exactly what he said is abominable. This is the problem. How can God righteously say to an unrighteous man, you are righteous? How can God continuously pass over sins and not repay sinners in full? That is abominable according to his own standard. Unless, verse 25, unless whom God intended as a propitiation through faith in his blood for a proof of his righteousness because of the passing over of former sins in the forbearance of God. You see, God sacrificed the Anointed One to prove that he is righteous, not unrighteous, certainly not abominable. God did not simply pretend that David and others did not sin. God did not close one eye or simply just sweep their sins under the carpet. Yes, God exercised forbearance, he restrained his wrath, he did not punish them in full, but later God poured out his wrath on the Anointed One, not for the Anointed One's own sins, but for the sins of God's originally unrighteous people. Therefore, in sacrificing the Anointed One, God's righteous justice was fully served. God never left a single sin of his originally unrighteous people unpunished. The death penalty was executed in full. Therefore, God's righteous character was revealed through his righteous judgment on sin. In fact, God sacrificed the Anointed One not just as proof that he had punished the former sins of his people. God sacrificed the Anointed One also, verse 26, for the proof of his righteousness at the present time, so that he might be righteous and the righteousifier of the one who has faith in Jesus. In other words, God sacrificed the Anointed One not just to fully punish the former sins of all his people from before Jesus came and atone for them all. People like David, Samuel, Moses, Abraham, Job, Noah, Enoch, Abel. God sacrificed the Anointed One to fully punish their former sins, yes, but also to fully punish the sins committed by His people in the present time, also, and to atone for all of us, basically all of God's people from all time. Jesus' death was the full ultimate atonement for every one of God's originally unrighteous people. Full atonement for all God's people, former and present. Clear proof that God is 100% righteous when He pronounces to believers, "You are righteous." God is not abominable. God never contradicts His righteous standards in Proverbs 17 verse 15. God is righteous because God punished sin with the death penalty, and His justice was fully served, and so His wrath was fully propitiated. How? All through Jesus' sin sacrifice on behalf of God's unrighteous people. This is the third way God's righteousness is manifested apart from Mosaic law, apart from works of Mosaic law, but manifested in the good news. Just look here. I already mentioned the two manifestations. Now the third manifestation is how God's righteousness is revealed. God's righteous character is manifested in righteously declaring righteous His originally unrighteous people. And this is how God righteously redeems the one who has faith in Jesus. This is why the redeemed are not required to do works of the Mosaic law in order for God to declare them righteous in His sight.